Welcome to the Frank Figliuzzi Show. You are going to be glad that you came. I want to do a very brief introduction because I want to spend every minute we have with our guest. You talk about the right time and the right place. Our guest today is Ruth Ben-Ghiat, and you know her likely as a history professor, scholar on authoritarianism and fascism. She's a professor at NYU. She got her undergrad at UCLA, her PhD from Brandeis, and boy, do I have questions. So without any further introduction, let's go to our guest, Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Ruth, thank you.
Sure, it's a pleasure.
Oh yeah, it's been a long time coming. We finally not only meet electronically, but we get to discuss something that's really on everybody's mind right now. So, look, you've authored books on the topic. Your latest book is Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present. We've got that graphic up on the screen so people can order it wherever they get their books from. And I want to start with a very, as they say, start from the beginning. I want to start with a question that says, how did you select this academic discipline, fascism, authoritarianism, particularly Italian history? How did you come to specialize in that?
So I grew up in a town in California that had a lot of people who had escaped Nazism. And so I grew up with the stories of these people who had to basically flee their countries and start over again. And excuse me. And so I decided, so I was going to do German history in graduate school. And then somebody said to me, why don't you do Italy? There's not as much on it, and it lasted twice as long as Nazism. And so I got a little grant to go for 1 month to Rome. And the minute I landed in Rome, I was like, I'm doing Italy. I love this.
I don't
the
blame
culture, it just spoke to me. Yeah. And it's also really interesting because the Allies made the Germans get rid of, all of they had denazification. There were no statues left, no symbols. Italy was very different. They treated them differently. And so the signs of fascism were all around. And that intrigued me.
Wow. And I assume that's where you learned your Italian. Is that correct?
Yes, I learned the classic way. I had, when I was in graduate school, a boyfriend who knew not a single word of English.
Totally immersion, as they say.
Yes. So, and then I lived there and worked in archives, and it was very important to actually live there for years as a student because the nuances of language, understanding the archival documents, if you're doing cultural history, working on films, culture is a very interesting resource when politics is just, monopolized by a one-party state. Culture sometimes is a place where there are spaces to maneuver for oppositional messages, but you have to really be fluent to be able to pick up on that.
Yeah, the original language is the key to getting the nuances and the meaning. And correct me if I'm wrong, you've authored books in Italian. Yeah.
Yeah, and they've been my first book on fascism and culture was translated into Italian, and I had some threats of lawsuits from families of people I mentioned in the book. It was considered quite controversial to be talking about the collaboration of people, when they were young with fascism. So I learned a lot about how fascist memories can stick around. And Mussolini is still revered by many people, and so it taught me a lot that I couldn't learn just from books.
Wow. So Mussolini still being revered gets me to my next question. Let's focus on what we can learn, good, bad, and ugly, from the Italian experience with Mussolini, what it tells us about where we are now.
Mm-hmm. So there are some fundamental huge differences. There we had a one-party state And Mussolini was the one who talked first about a totalitarian state where the party is in control of everything. He said everything inside the state, nothing outside the state. Of course, no elections. They had referendums, no opposition of any kind, no criticism. It's something like North Korea today. So today is very different because, many autocrats come to power via elections. Now, Mussolini was appointed by the king. Hitler was also appointed. But today it's elections, and today people keep elections going, and then they game the system through voter suppression, through all kinds of tricks, media capture. So that's a big difference. It's a big difference. We wouldn't be sitting here.
The appearance
Yeah.
of free and fair elections.
That's right. It's almost like a simulation. That's why Viktor Orban called it a liberal democracy, to kind of simulate it. Now, but there's a lot of things when you write a book like Strongmen that goes over 100 years. A lot of things stay the same, and one of them is the personality cult, the leader cult. The kind of rules of the leader cult it's incredible. They really haven't changed. And Mussolini, who came in almost a decade before Hitler, was the one to really kind of cement these rules, and he was hugely popular in America. So one is that you have to be a man of the people. You're relatable. You're the man everybody wants to be. So Mussolini used to strip his shirt off on camera, that kind, which Hitler never did. And so he relates to Putin in that way, a kind of hyper-masculinity. But he's also the man above all other men. The man who often is acclaimed as a kind of semi-deity. And so they have a collusion with the church, that says that they're there by the will of God. So you're the everyday man, but you're the man who's untouchable. And that really hasn't changed in 100 years.
Wow. Almost every sentence you said is resonating, I'm sure, not only with me, but with everybody listening. So let's talk about some of the things you just said. The man of the people, does that count even if you're a billionaire and you're is there any metaphor, analogy to other fascist leaders?
Yeah, so it's all about how you market yourself. And if you market yourself as a populist, it doesn't matter. And you may be a billionaire, but you're going to take care of the little people. So when Trump came and he said, you were forgotten and you're forgotten no longer. I love you. This is the kind of outreach that makes people think, well, yeah, they may be a billionaire and they could admire him for being successful, but he's also cares about the little man. And that is, of course, a fraudulent, thing. And people find out too late that that's actually not the case.
I think a lot of people may be in that process of finding out economically,
so.
At least right now. And that, but
they are.
Please.
Yeah, this is a really interesting time because when you have a successful personality cult, and Trump has one, and we've been in this for 10 years. Like it's 10 years since he said I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and I wouldn't lose any followers. And that statement, I was already writing a little bit about Trump, but that statement is what really galvanized me to say, I have a skill set here. I understand fascism. This is a fascist statement. And I have to warn the American people. I have to start my whole civic education thing. So when you have especially in a one-party state like Mussolini's or Hitler's, etc., it's very hard for people to come to terms with the truth because they don't hear the truth. So in those countries, it literally took being bombed by the Allies and starting to lose the war, where people had family members. They knew that military people were coming home with no legs, or they weren't coming home at all. So that's what it took. But here we're in a process where we're starting to fit the conditions under which today's studies say that people start to wake up. And one is blatant corruption. If the government and the leader are just getting really rich, that was partly why Viktor Orban lost and had to concede. Another is autocratic overreach. either the state is on the streets being openly brutal, and we have ICE, or they're actually, we don't discuss this enough, they're just absent because these people don't care. They're in power to get rich and to amass more power. So, and then the third is that when they cause hardship, economic hardship, and we are getting in that zone, and so people are starting to wake up and say, well, this isn't what I voted for.
You're giving us some hope, Ruth, which is in short supply these days. So it's not necessarily true that some absolutely god-awful event, now the things you rattled off, the brutality from ICE and economic collapse, I'm not trying to diminish those, but it's not necessarily true that widespread carnage or death needs to occur.
No, today, because we are actually, and we're not hearing about this. We hear all about autocracy is spreading, but we're not hearing about that there's this worldwide renaissance of protest, mostly nonviolent.
Mm-hmm.
In a lot of countries are having the biggest turnouts for protests they ever had, and it's translating into dislodging elites. Like in South Asia, there's a lot going on. And often so people have analyzed it, and there's a lot of young people. So there's a whole category of Gen Z protests.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the things that are motivating people are what I said before. It's the corruption, just the blatant unfairness and injustice of things. The not caring, so the state just isn't there because they don't, being too obvious, they don't care about you, or being overly brutal. I don't know how any brutality is overly brutal, but
of course,
just an escalation of brutality.
Right.
And then people start to see that their lives, like in Hungary, this happened, that the country was impoverished while the cronies got to be billionaires. Wow. And that's happening, and that's what's spurring. So it doesn't have to be, if you go into a war and it goes badly, that's what happened to Mussolini. That's not good, mm-hmm. But it doesn't have to be a war or a cataclysmic event.
So much to learn from history, as it says over the National Archives. The past is prologue. But let's look at Hitler briefly. And Sean, let's put up the lovely image of Mussolini and Hitler together doing their salute. Mussolini, of course, has to have his arm higher than Hitler, which he's working on the correct salute. What are compare and contrast? What are the key differences and that you see, and then again trying to apply it to what we're seeing in our country today with regard to authoritarianism? And are there elements of both here? You've certainly mentioned Mussolini. What about Adolf Hitler?
Yeah, there are many elements. One is the use of the incredibly efficient use of propaganda. And here's a good way to gauge how skillful Trump has been at this, because Trump did not have a one-party state. He didn't have a Goebbels. He's kind of his own Goebbels, and he's very, very skilled at messaging, at images. He's incredible at this. And so even working in a modern context without the the closed state that Hitler had, Trump was able to convince hundreds of millions of people that he won the 2020 election. He was able to convince people of a very easily empirically verifiable fact that was false, and even have an insurrection that he incited a violent mob to come on the Capitol. And so those kinds of things, they can happen in a different circumstance, but they can be equally effective. And that's dispiriting. But the Nazis are famous for having a method where Goebbels said early on, we have to bring the Jewish question to the attention of the public, because there was lots of people didn't like Jews or didn't trust them because maybe they heard anti-Judaism comments in school or in religion. But the Jew was not the state enemy. And that's what the Nazis were able to do. They targeted, one enemy, and they put all of the force of the state toward that. And yet it was never just Jews. In fact, the first people going into Dachau were, leftists, were Jehovah's Witnesses, other kinds of people, and then later became the Jews. So one of the lessons is, we're building this infrastructure of repression for immigrants, but those are not the only people who are being targeted, and there are multiple ways to target people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you talk to people like Jim Comey and Letitia James and John Brennan and all of us who've been sued and pursued, that's one way of doing it as well. So myriad enemies, almost too many, quite frankly. Let's talk about you mentioned one of the things you mentioned was this kind of macho look where Mussolini without his shirt on, and thank God Trump has spared us from that image of himself. However, you also mentioned a semi-deity type attitude, and of course we've got images that come at us all the time of that are Christ-like of Trump. As he says, doctored images, or I was a doctor. What is that the equivalent?
Yeah, and Trump does this thing with images of Jesus when he feels extremely threatened. When he had his criminal trial, which was a whole spectacle. If you study authoritarian spectacles, you remember how like Matt Gaetz and everybody would show up in New York and they would wear the Trump uniform.
Yep.
Like that was an interesting thing. But during that time, Trump released a sketch. It was supposed to be like a courtroom sketch. And it was him, having to be there testifying or whatever. And Jesus was next to him. So and that plays on something that also has not changed since Mussolini. It's called the authoritarian bargain, where they make bargains with elites, religious elites. In this case, we'll talk about, could be business elites, media elites, and they have like an alliance. And so the elites say, okay, they are promised riches and prosperity if they will be loyal in all circumstances to the leader, no matter what he does. So religious elites think of Putin and the Russian Orthodox Church. But Mussolini, who was a total atheist, Frank, I cannot emphasize how much Mussolini hated religion. He even wrote a book when he was young about a cardinal who had a mistress. Like his whole thing was to expose the fraud of religion. And yet he was the person who made the alliance with the Catholic Church and did the Lateran Accords and restored Catholicism into schools. So these are transactional people. But when they have these alliances, it's really good for them because the more corrupt they become, the more they need the halo of holiness. They need Jesus next to him, or even saying he is Jesus, thanks to AI today. So Mussolini actually, so here we're 100 years ago, we didn't have AI, but he ordered people to refer to him. In Italian, he is Lui, L-U-I. So when you see fascist documents, the Lui had to be capitalized. So in English, if you wrote about him, it had to be he with a capital H, as though he were a god or God himself.
Yeah.
So these things, that's another example of something that doesn't change.
So with all of these kind of similarities, a couple of and points of comparison, and we could go on and on about, the macho thing. So he may not appear to be macho, but he all of his imagery is macho. And then he selects people like Hegseth, who does 47 push-ups every morning and tells the military, you're all fat. And RFK Jr. is got his shirt off, working out and tan, 24/7. So do you think Trump is smart enough to know all of what you've just recited, or he's got handlers? Where is this coming from?
I'm smiling because this is a very frequent question that I get. It's a very important question. So Trump doesn't read. He's a particular case. Mussolini and Hitler like to read a lot, and other people today. But I do believe Ivana, his first wife, now deceased in suspicious circumstances, that when they were married, he had in his bedroom 2 books. This is Trump.
Yeah.
He had Art of the Deal, and he had a book of Hitler's speeches. So he knows, he has ideas about the leaders he likes. Remember, he told General Kelly in the first administration that he wanted his generals to be acting like Hitler's generals.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes he's wrong, but he
Right.
has a sense of, and he also looks very
Didn't Hitler's
carefully.
generals try to kill him?
Yes, they did. So
Okay, I'm just saying.
Kelly, well, Kelly had to tell him that, like in 1944 and other times, there were assassination attempts. I have that in my strongmen book and in the resistance chapter.
Yeah.
So he has a sense of what kind of model of leadership he likes, and that's why he's always talking about Putin and Xi, and he looks to those people and he watches what they're doing. He'll talk about like the justice system of the Chinese, where, oh, he can say he wants to execute someone and then it can be done in like 5 hours. You don't have to wait around.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
But really what I concluded is that, unfortunately, I learned to my dismay, and I wrote this during the first administration, that Trump had a very similar character to a lot of these other people. And I'm talking like Idi Amin, Gaddafi, that they're completely amoral, they're completely transactional. They truly see people as pawns and assets to be used.
Mhm.
They know how, they have an instinct about people's weaknesses so that they can, control them either through compromat or other things. So they're very skilled in an instinctual level. And then the last thing I'd say is, because they have no morals,
Mhm.
they will do things, if they see a juncture for action, they will do things that other people wouldn't do because they're lawless. They're basically lawless. So nothing is off the table. And thus we woke up one day and we learned that Trump had ordered Maduro kidnapped.
Yeah.
Now, however you felt about Maduro, that's a kind of lawless thing that most people wouldn't have done.
Yeah. Or how about double tapping people in boats in the water, and we're not sure, and
Exactly.
Congress is not sure who those people
Exactly.
are. Yeah.
And it's very important because sometimes people will write me and say, well, you're only talking about leaders. It's a system. And the leader's values or absence thereof have to be echoed in the people he chooses for top positions.
Right.
And
Right.
so we have various individuals in cabinet positions who are there with pasts that perhaps are not the best,
Yeah. Or
such as
as you say,
Hegseth.
right, unqualified, so they've kind of
Mhm.
got no other job they can get. They toe the line, but even brilliant people. So yesterday we saw the nomination hearing for Kevin Warsh to head the Federal Reserve. This guy he's still the real deal. And when asked the question, who won the election, he couldn't answer it. He couldn't answer it.
This is really instructive. I have a Substack called Lucid, and I just published on this yesterday, that propaganda requires noise, and we know that, like blobbity blobbity from the loudspeakers in Hitler's era and from social media platforms. So it requires circulation of falsehoods and noise, but it also requires silence. And there are things that you, in a well-run authoritarian party or state, whether it's like an old-fashioned dictatorship or today, your status in the party and in government comes from being able to echo the propaganda of the leader, and that means sometimes not saying things. So the truth that Biden won the election in 2020 cannot be said today, and it's become a loyalty requirement for anybody who wants to serve Trump.
Absolutely.
Accent on serve.
Yeah.
And that's how you know that this has become a thoroughly authoritarian structure.
It is the baseline threshold for entry. Absolutely. Religion is intriguing here. You certainly have referenced it with Mussolini. And I don't know about Hitler. I'd like to learn a little bit more about that. And with regard to Trump, yes, transactional, absolutely. So this whole born again evangelical Christian nationalism, I'm sure there are, very few people who, well, maybe more than I think, who actually believe that, Donald Trump has converted and all of that. But what I find intriguing, Ruth, is not only the use of the Christian nationalists and evangelicals and the duping of them, but this kind of recent faux pas with Catholicism, right?
Yes.
What are you thinking about all of that?
It's really complicated because one of the things that surprised me when I wrote Strongmen, I have a lot of through lines, a lot of sub themes. And one of them is the presence of Opus Dei, a far right Catholic sect, how dominant they have been in authoritarian states. They've been given huge responsibility, especially for the economy in Franco's Spain, in Pinochet's Chile. Then you go to Berlusconi, who's there in a state that has the Vatican inside it. And many Opus Dei people were very prominent. And I was very surprised to find how many people were prominent in Opus Dei or adjacent to Opus Dei in the Trump administration. Larry Kudlow, Pat Cipollone, William Barr, and I didn't expect that. And so that was
Bill Barr adjacent. How about John Durham, special counsel
John
to
Durham.
investigate the investigators?
And I also didn't realize till recently when this started happening with the insulting of Catholicism, that Kevin Roberts of Heritage is close to Opus Dei. And so there's a through line of that. So there's a very important strain of far right radical Catholicism that has been in the past important to MAGA and DeSantis. There's many strains of this. And so here comes in the middle Vance, who is disrupting this. Now, the reason he's critiquing the Pope is very clear, because it's their worst nightmare that an American Pope, God sent or Francis sent an American Pope who's formed in Peru with indigenous justice and is here on this earth to deliver democratic progressive notions of equality and human rights, and it's their worst nightmare. So in that sense, it makes it's logical that they're going to attack him, but it's such a faux pas, as you said. It's so counterproductive.
So the Pope is the wrong kind of Catholic for them.
Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong, and I boy, I don't want to get this wrong, and maybe I need to go research this, but has Pope Leo, or maybe it was Francis, made some gestures against Opus Dei that they're kind of trying to figure out what to do with Opus Dei? I think that was true for Francis.
Francis, I'm not a huge expert on this, but I do know. Francis wanted to look into it, and he started to, but there was an article in The Guardian recently that Gareth Gore, who wrote a very detailed, years in the making, investigative journalist book on Opus Dei, he was contacted by the Vatican, and Pope Leo wanted to see him and had read his book. And so Gareth Gore went to the Vatican and was received by the Pope. He couldn't believe it and found the Pope extremely informed, and got the impression that he wanted to go beyond Francis in doing something about Opus Dei.
Okay.
So that is going on.
Yeah.
But everything about this Pope is extremely threatening, starting from the fact he's American, and ending with his social justice precepts. And it's a very dynamic, shall we say, time in the Catholic and Christian world.
For sure. Yeah, taking on the Catholic Church is quite the project if they want to do it. And it makes me wonder, and we'd have to find out when J.D. Vance started drafting his new book. Yes. That's coming out about his conversion. We'd have to find out when he decided to do that. It was a quick announcement for a book that's not, correct me if I'm wrong, not out yet. And my wonder is if this is the deliberate counter to say, look, I'm the right kind of Catholic, and here's my book about it.
Yeah, I read this as just as though we needed more confirmation that Vance is an authoritarian, because and remember that Vance is the proxy of Peter Thiel. who has been going around giving lectures about Antichrist and setting himself up as some kind of divinity or prophet of a kind of knowledge that is the right knowledge. And these are fanatics. They are fanatics who believe that there's only one way to be faithful. They're not pluralists in the religious or the political sphere. And I actually, when Vance said that the Pope, quote, should be very careful in
when he talks about theology,
I actually, this is my training. This is like organized crime talk. This is how, like, if they issue warnings, I mean, there's Italian language equivalents of like, they should be careful. They should watch what they're doing. And I read this as a veiled threat, not a physical threat, but it was very interesting that he used that language to the Pope. So,
but also putting it, I saw that as almost, I did laugh, laughable. I didn't. I'm with you on the veiled threat because now that I hear you saying it, but I also saw it as I am the expert on how to be a Catholic, and I'm going to write an authoritative book on it. And
so, yeah, it's because if you see MAGA as having elements of cult ideology and even beyond Trump's personal cult, because we all know like Vance is supposed to be a successor, so that relationship is, just a little cloudy, let's say. But the way that authoritarians think is that, including Thiel, including Vance, is that there's only one way to think about these things, and they can't have any rivals, because if you accept a rival way of thinking, then it's pluralism, and they don't do pluralism.
You're right. Yeah. So Hitler and or Mussolini, did they try to correct the church or bring the church in and say you can preach this but not that?
Yeah, I mean, early on, this is important. So Mussolini came to power through extreme violence. The black shirts, the squads, right? And Hitler had his brown shirts, but it was far more extensive violence in Italy. And people don't remember that it wasn't just leftists who were getting beaten up and, whatever, all kinds of things happened to them, killed. It was also priests who were socially progressive. There was a big movement of like socially progressive Christianity and Catholicism in Italy in the early 1920s. There was even a big party called the Popular Party. And this was very threatening to the fascists. And this is way before they made the deal with the Vatican. And in fact, the guy, he was a saintly figure, Don Luigi Sturzo, and he was the head of this party. And they got huge numbers in an election in the early 1920s, far surpassing the fascist party, and he shut them down, Mussolini, and he forced Sturzo into exile because they had to have they were persecuting the church and individual priests all the time. And then when he declares the dictatorship, it has to be all institutionalized. So he's reaching out to the Vatican and the Pope, and they make their deal.
Got it. I'm reading a book called Bread and Wine, and it's translated into English, thank goodness, from the original Italian. But it's a novel, and one of the things that struck me. Are you familiar with it?
Yeah, I used to teach it.
My.
And you reminded me that I'm due to teach it again, and I also have some interesting things to say about Silone, the author.
Oh my goodness!
But tell me what.
Well, I'd like to hear that. But if for people who want to tackle a rather old book that's translated into English, it's Bread and Wine. But it's a novel, World War II era fascism. But one of the things that got me was the main character in the book is part of the resistance and is pretending to be a priest. He wears a clerical garb. Yeah. And I couldn't help but think, okay, we've got a lot of pretend Christians walking around right now, and they're not the resistance; they're the problem. But I don't know what your insights are, since you used to teach the book.
Yeah, so that book. So Silone was a communist, and he had to go to exile. And so that book was he was showing on the one hand how the peasants, who were largely illiterate, were not really socialized into fascism. They knew, of course, they knew Mussolini, but you could work with them, and communists wanted to convert them and get them away from fascism. So that's partly, and he posed as a priest because he thought that was the best way to interact with them, because they may have been more politically illiterate, but they were pious. And so that's why he was a priest. It came out later, Frank, that Silone was actually spying for the fascists.
Okay, I did not know that.
And there were documents in the Central State Archive, like our national archives, that prove this. And being Italy, the head of the archive had come upon these documents, and he's like, nobody could see these. So he took them home.
Right.
He just took them home so nobody could see them, which isn't exactly like perfect archival practice.
Wow.
So for a long time, and then it came out that he was like doing a double thing.
Yeah.
And so that made people go back to his books. But that book it's really worth reading because it gives a sense of everyday life under fascism, both in the cities and the countryside. And what he reports about the life of a dissident with the safe houses and everything, that's true. He lived that. And so did, thousands of other dissidents.
Well, and the peasants, you mentioned making the archives go away. We now have a new rule in Washington that the presidential documents, the Records Act, doesn't apply, and they don't they don't have to preserve Trump's records.
As a historian, you can imagine how I feel about that.
Unbelievable. And then, not to dwell on the book, and I know our time is waning, but I wanted to just point out the peasants' reaction to religion is that in the book is that it's all bogus. The peasants are far more, the cafone as they're called, they're far more interested in conspiracy theories, superstition, curses and hexes, right? Than they just dismiss the religion as largely useless unless it's combined with all kinds of conspiracy theories. And I just see so much of an intersection with what we see today.
Yeah. Oh, I'm going to have to go back and read it again.
Hey, in the remaining 2 minutes we have, and I know you have to go, I'd love to keep you longer. You're a counselor or advisor to the Protect Democracy organization. Tell us what that is.
This was an organization started around 2017 by Ian Bassin and other people who had worked for the Obama DOJ, and it's grown hugely. It joins in with litigation to protect democracy. It's a kind of it's vigilant. It has a whole election task force to protect our elections. So it's really grown to be a clearinghouse for all areas of democratic institutions. It takes more of an institutional approach because it was founded by people who were in the institutions.
Good.
And it has help for people who are being targeted. It's really an incredible organization. I'm very proud of Ian and his colleagues for having built it up over these last years.
Well, thank you for being a part of it. I know you have to go do your professor thing, and
I do.
We'll talk about joining you on and remind everybody quickly where they can find you, and maybe I'll be able to join your show.
Yeah, I'll have you on. I publish a Substack on democracy and authoritarianism called Lucid. And I have Zooms every week with guests for paying subscribers. I keep the payer thing at the very minimum, as I've had it for 5 years, my Substack. And so, yes, I hope to see you on there for a great continuation of our conversation.
Ruth, thank you so much for joining us. You're doing God's work, and we appreciate it so much. See you soon. Stay safe.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye now. So I'm going to hang in there, folks, if you don't mind, just for a minute, and share a brief statement on what many of you already know, which is that I guess back in June of early June of last year, I was sued by Kash Patel, the FBI director, for statements I made on what was then MSNBC and specifically the Morning Joe show. I was sued for defamation. Yesterday, I learned that my suit has been dismissed. Our motion to dismiss was granted. It's been a long time coming, and I'm grateful for the judge's decision and the larger message here, which is that we still have a First Amendment. We still have a free press if we fight for it. And the courts, in some circumstances, are still holding folks. So I always like to end with good news. That's my good news for the day. Thanks to Ruth and all of you for joining. I'll see you next time. Thank you.